Webinar on RDA, Revising, Developing, and Assessing. I'm Felicity Dykes, Chair of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I will be your host today. Our presenter is Kathy Glennan. Kathy is Head of Metadata Creation and Enhancement at the University of Maryland and has more than 25 years of experience cataloging scores and sound recordings. She has served on many cataloging-related committees in the American Library Association, and last July, Kathy became the ALA representative to the Joint Steering Committee for the Development of RDA. So she brings a wealth of knowledge to today's topic, and I'm delighted to have her with us. Here are a few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. Today's webinar does not have interactive chat capabilities. We have more than 400 attendees, and you're all muted. So you can comment on today's webinar using Twitter. The hashtag is on the screen here. Now, if you have a question or comment for Kathy, type those into the question box on your screen, and Kathy will address them during the webinar. Questions which remain unanswered while we're on the air will be answered offline, and we'll send those answers out to everyone. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll receive an email with links to the recording, the slides, and an evaluation within 2 days. So now let me turn this over to Kathy. There'll be a slight delay as we switch speakers.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. As Felicity mentioned, I'm Kathy Glennan, Head of Metadata Creation and Enhancement at the University of Maryland. In July 2013, I became the ALA representative to the Joint Steering Committee for the Development of RDA, succeeding John Addig in this role. And for those of you who don't know what I look like, we'll have to see if this works. There we are, my smiling face for you. Here are the topics that will be covered in today's webinar. I plan on responding to your questions after the first two sections, the background on the JSC, its constituencies, and how ALA fits in, and on making changes to RDA and to the LC-PCC Policy Statements. Then I can also take questions after the second two topics, the RDA changes coming in April, and topics the JSC will likely consider this year. But before I proceed further, I have a quick poll to have you respond to get a better understanding of your experience with RDA to date. Please pick the response that best represents you or your institution's approach. Whether you're doing everything in RDA, original cataloging, some combination of selected things, creating hybrid records, or you haven't even tried RDA out at all. As you respond, I can let you know what we're doing at the University of Maryland. At the moment, we're in the selected cataloging and RDA category. Original catalogers have been encouraged to create RDA records as they become more comfortable in using the standard. Our copy catalogers have been accepting copy regardless of the code used. Because our primary discovery layer is WorldCat Local, we have not explored creating hybrid records. This will come naturally as the master records in OCLC continue to change. All right, I think can probably close this out. 85% of you voted. Fantastic. So what I see here is that 28% are doing all original cataloging, 18% are doing copy cataloging, 53% are doing some selected combination. So it's good to know we're in the majority here at Maryland. 21% are creating hybrid records with some RDA elements, and 18% of you have not yet started with RDA. But don't fear, you will. All right, moving on. Let's talk about the JSC first. The JSC has 7 voting members who represent professional associations, national libraries, or some combination of the two. These are ALA, the Australian Committee on Cataloging, the British Library, the Canadian Committee on Cataloging, CILIP, which stands for the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals, located in the UK, the Deutsche Nationalbibliothek, and the Library of Congress. In addition, the JSC has a separate chair and a secretary. The terms of the voting members are determined by the organizations they represent. For example, the ALA representative has a 3-year term with the possibility of 1 renewal. The JSC forms working groups to assist in the development of RDA by producing discussion papers, recommendations, proposals, and other documentation for consideration by the JSC. Current working groups include the Examples Group, the RDA Music Joint Working Group, the Places Working Group, the RDA Onyx Framework Working Group, and the Technical Working Group. Members of a JSC working group may include representatives of JSC constituencies and other appropriate bodies. The bottom line is that we are looking for qualified people and want the expertise at the table. The JSC holds an annual meeting to consider formal proposals and discussion papers. The next JSC meeting is tentatively set for the first week in November 2014 and will likely be held in Washington, D.C. Outside of face-to-face meetings, the JSC conducts its business through email, conference calls, Google Drive documents, etc. throughout the year. Here's a picture of the JSC membership during our last in-person meeting, which was held at the ALA office in Washington, D.C. As we sought a place for the ever-required annual photo, we were pleased to find a location where we could have bookshelves in the background. The JSC considers proposals and discussion papers from several different sources. Beyond proposals from the JSC constituencies, the following external groups have provided papers for JSC consideration over the past several years. URIG, the European RDA Interest Group, YAML, the International Association of Music Libraries, Archives, and Music Documentation Centers, IFLA's ISBD Review Group, and the ISSN International Center. Here's another way to look at how proposals and discussion papers make their way to the JSC. First of all, there are those constituencies. We normally refer to ourselves by our acronyms, but those are the same 7 I read off to you a little bit earlier. Then there are the working groups. They don't go through a constituency. They go straight to the JSC with their documentation. And the external groups do the same. They don't necessarily have a representative at the table, but communicate directly to the JSC chair. Within each of these groups, specifically within the constituencies and certainly within the external groups, the procedures for creating and approving a particular proposal or discussion paper may vary. Let's take a look now at how this works for ALA. The ELECTS Committee on Cataloging, Description and Access, commonly known as CCDA, is the body within ALA responsible for developing official positions on additions and revisions to RDA. CCDA has 9 voting members and approximately 30 liaisons, representing groups both internal to ALA, such as ACRL and RUSA, and external groups, such as the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative and the Special Libraries Association. However, if RDA changes under consideration affect subjects, the ELECTS Subject Analysis Committee, known as SAC, takes the lead in creating and/or responding to proposals and discussion papers. SAC has a similar structure to CCDA in terms of voting members and liaisons. In addition, SAC has established a separate subcommittee on RDA. The Program for Cooperative Cataloging, or PCC, is among the external groups who have liaisons to CCDA. PCC has played a significant role in RDA implementation and interpretation, especially within the U.S. While the Library of Congress serves as the PCC Secretariat, suggestions for changes to RDA from PCC come through the ALA representative, not the LC representative, to the JSC. The PCC Standing Committee on Standards takes the lead in working on RDA-related issues. In addition, PCC forms task groups to address specific concerns. In the past few years, these have included the Non-Mark Name Authority Task Group, the Relationship Designator Guidelines Task Group, and the Access Points for Expressions Task Group. Another way to do this is another little graphic about, well, perhaps you'll think about it as how my life is complicated. I'm back here in the little corner, the ALA JSC rep. And for the most part, I get my marching orders from CCDA, who's responsible for creating or approving proposals and discussion papers relating to description. Sometimes I will need to take feedback from the JSC back to CCDA for additional work. CCDA gets some of its information not only from its own members, but from task forces that are formed to make proposals or write discussion papers. And again, that communication might go both ways. Beyond that, CCDA constituents may also make proposals or write discussion papers, and those constituents include the aforementioned Program for Cooperative Cataloging, the Music Library Association, the Online Audiovisual Catalogers, and the American Association of Law Libraries. Those four examples are constituents who have actively written proposals and discussion papers in the last couple of years for CCDA consideration. In addition, I already mentioned the SAC RDA subcommittee, who feeds their work in through SAC, and then that would go to me. Now, it's possible that I might also need to send things back to SAC. Finally, other individuals or groups might make suggestions, and depending on what those suggestions are, they might come to me directly. They could go to CCDA directly. And you can see I even added this crazy-looking arrow from CCDA constituents directly to me. That is depending on the nature of the change. It might not need to go through CCDA. I'll talk about fast-track proposals in a moment, and those things don't necessarily need to be vetted through CCDA. So there's a lot of communication and back and forth going on, as you can see. Part of what comes into play in the decision-making process is where a particular change should take place. If the instructions themselves need clarification, then an RDA proposal is in order. However, some problems are better addressed through application guidelines, and examples of these include the LC-PCC Policy Statements, the BIBCO and CONSER Standard Record Guidelines, an instruction for the creation of name and series authority records in LC's Descriptive Cataloging Manual, Section Z1. Some specialist communities have also been developing best practices for RDA, which provide further guidance and examples related to specific types of resources, such as music or AV. Beyond these are your own institutional policies, which may include how certain options within RDA should be applied. And finally, sometimes no further policy or guidelines are actually needed. Just use your own cataloger's judgment with the needs of the user in mind. RDA change proposals may affect one or more sections of RDA, the instructions and examples themselves, the glossary, the mappings, such as RDA to MARC and vice versa, the registered vocabularies, and so forth. These can result in one of three things: completely new content, revised content, or deleted content. The JSC supports two means of updating RDA: the formal proposal process and the fast-track process. The formal process requires the creation of a detailed document providing the rationale for the proposed changes and both a marked up and clean copy of the affected instructions. All of the official JSC constituencies are required to respond in writing to these formal proposals, and these form the basis of the JSC's annual meeting agenda. And here's a picture of what I took, printouts of both proposals and discussion papers and their responses to the annual JSC meeting in 2013. Yes, I did some muscle building in this part of that week. Typically, the changes from the annual JSC meeting are incorporated into RDA the following April. The fast-track changes are designed to address consistency in wording, additions of definitions and examples, and other changes that do not impact the application of the instructions. Due to the nature of the fast-track proposals, there is no formal vetting process by the constituencies. Instead, JSC members may accept or reject the proposed change, request further discussion, or recommend the creation of a formal proposal for constituency review. If a fast-track proposal is accepted, the changes will appear in the next available toolkit release. In 2014, there will be 4 releases or updates to the RDA toolkit. The February release technically, happened last week. The April update contains all of the changes approved by the JSC at the November meeting. The August release, which will be focused on the German translation and hopefully the introduction of the Spanish translation, and the October release. Most of these releases will include some fast-track changes, as well as the addition of policy statements for PCC and other national libraries. For example, the policy statements for the National Library of Australia were just added this month. The number and scope of the RDA toolkit releases have recently been affected by the creation and maintenance of various translations of RDA as its adoption becomes more international. The behind-the-scenes workload increases as each translation is incorporated. You may have noticed that several highlights of the most recent toolkit releases have been related to greater functionality in viewing translations. I should note that the base text for RDA remains English, and all revisions are proposed and approved for that text. However, the approval and publication deadlines for the English version means that it is difficult to keep the various translations in sync. And the number of RDA translations is likely to grow significantly in the next few years. Beyond the Spanish version I just mentioned that is under development, this may also include Finnish, Chinese, Japanese, and Italian. Once the JSC agrees to modify RDA through either the formal or fast-track process, then those changes need to be rolled out to the RDA text. These updates, along with changes in toolkit functionality, took place 3 times in 2013. As you can imagine, a single proposal normally affects multiple instructions. This slide shows a raw count of changed instructions within each 2013 release of the RDA toolkit, and that pie chart adds up to about 630 instructions all told. Some of these changes were substantive, others were more editorial in nature. You can see with the July update last year is when the changes from the JSC 2012 meeting were incorporated into the toolkit, but there were also fast-track changes that were incorporated in that update. The other 2 releases in May and November were exclusively fast-track changes that affected the instructions, and you can see that they were about on pace with each other. As I mentioned earlier, the LC-PCC Policy Statements provide more specific guidance and examples, including explicit statements about which optional additions or deletions to follow. Some of the policy statements were essentially carried over from the LC rule interpretations for AACR2, but those have been reevaluated in the context of RDA. Others are entirely new to RDA. This is a continually evolving process with oversight by the PCC Standing Committee on Standards. Suggestions for new or modified policy statements come from within the PCC membership, including the Library of Congress, and also from subject experts who may or may not be officially under the PCC umbrella. Again, the interest is in bringing the appropriate expertise to the discussions. Creating or modifying the LC-PCC policy statements can be an interim step to changing RDA itself. This occurred in the realm of treaties, where the policy statement essentially said, don't use RDA for determining access points for treaties until the JSC approves changes to meet the needs of the law cataloging community. And for music, which extended the use of cognates for the name of a type of composition. In both of these cases, the JSC has now taken action, and the respective changes will be in the April 2014 Toolkit update, and I'll talk about that in the second half of the webinar. At this point, well, once they're published, the policy statements will need to be reevaluated to see if they need to be revised or simply deleted. Depending on various circumstances, policy statement changes may be incorporated into each toolkit release. you can see this was one of those depending on circumstances situations. There theoretically should, or at least could have been, an opportunity to add policy statements in November of 2013, but with the U.S. government shutdown that was not possible. However, those intended changes were just published last week in the toolkit. So this is a raw count of the number of policy statements changed in both the May release and the July update in 2013. Best practices and other format or subject-specific guidelines may be developed by specialist communities, such as the Music Library Association, ACRL's Rare Books and Manuscripts section, and the online audiovisual catalogers. The nature of these guidelines and their dissemination may take different forms. There may be documents that address a single topic or comprehensive best practices that might be developed. At the moment, these best practices are typically available on the originating body's website. However, discussions are underway to see how to incorporate such documents, or at least links to them, in the RDA toolkit itself. As I mentioned earlier, local policies are up to you and/or your institution. These could include which elements you want in records beyond those identified as core, or always providing access points for institutional authors. As with other RDA-based guidelines, these should be revisited at least annually after the toolkit update that includes changes arising from the JSC meeting. The content of your local documentation can be incorporated into the toolkit and shared institutionally or even internationally. For example, the British Library has made their guide to RDA name authority records available to everyone via the Tools tab in the toolkit under Workflows. So, how long does it take to get a change made to RDA itself? Here's one example from 2012. A PCC task group recommended expanding the source of information for ISSNs to be any source. At the time, this was limited to just the resource itself. This affected two different instructions, RDA 2.12.8, ISSN of series, and 2.12.16, ISSN of subseries. ALA submitted this to the JSC as a fast-track proposal, but the JSC decided that a formal proposal would be needed instead. The fast-track explanation for the JSC served as the basis for the formal proposal, which CCDA approved a few months after the issue was originally identified. ALA finalized the formal proposal, and the other JSC constituencies commented on it over the summer. The original proposal and the responses served as the basis for the JSC's discussion in November, and a few changes were made in the process of approving the proposal. The JSC Secretary then finalized the language that the JSC agreed upon, and the changed instruction appeared in the July 2013 update of the RDA Toolkit. So even though this was a fairly simple fix, the elapsed time from idea to implementation was about 18 months. Sometimes modifying RDA takes longer, especially if the identified problems and possible solutions are complex. In this case, as soon as RDA was published in 2010, the Music Library Association and the online audiovisual catalogers, among others, started seeking ways to modify the instructions relating to the basis for identification of the resource in RDA 2.1.2.2 and RDA 2.1.2.3. The goal was to create clearer instructions that specifically included preferring a collective title when available, using a predominant work to represent the resource as a whole, and clarifying the instructions for resources issued in more than one part. The challenge was to create instructions that applied to all resources regardless of format, while also supporting the needs of these specialist communities. It was quite a balancing act. Although the problem was identified in 2010, it took until September 2011 for CCDA to form a task force to work on these issues. The group presented a progress report to CCDA at midwinter 2012 and sought guidance on particular approaches. They then took that feedback and continued to work on developing a proposal to change RDA. At ALA Annual in 2012, they made another report to CCDA, which highlighted the specific problems that still needed resolution and again sought advice about how to proceed. As an outcome of that meeting, the task force finalized the proposal, CCDA approved it, and it was posted on the JSC website as an agenda item for the November meeting. The other JSC constituencies provided formal responses, and these formed the basis for the JSC discussion. As with the fairly simple fix, the proposal was modified as a result of the JSC meeting, and the JSC Secretary again created a final version of the changes to all of the affected instructions. Those changes rolled out to the RDA Toolkit in the July 2013 update. A review process also exists for the LC-PCC Policy Statements. Here's an example. In April 2012, a PCC task group identified the need for specific guidelines for both ongoing and individual instances of conferences. This was referred to the Standing Committee on Standards, who determined that this should be addressed with an LC-PCC policy statement rather than requiring a revision to RDA itself. The committee reviewed, refined, and approved the final wording of the policy statement for inclusion in the toolkit, and this modification appeared in the May 2013 release. I'd be happy to take any of your questions now about what I've covered so far. As you think about that, I'd also like to open a second survey, just to find out how whether have you participated in any of this process in reviewing RDA. So please select the entry that represents your highest level of participation. It shouldn't surprise you to know that I've worked my way through all of these. I don't think you can become the ALA representative to the JSC without having your hand in most of this stuff. Well, great. I'm seeing that about half of you have created local RDA documentation. That's fantastic. And let me see if I can actually read any of your questions at the moment here. All right. Is there a template or set of guidelines on the writing of detailed proposals? Yes, there are some guidelines that CCDA maintains about how to write a proposal, and it involves writing a background statement about the need identified, the issues that you're trying to solve, and then going forward and setting forth the options. Sometimes proposals will include one or two different choices about solving a particular problem. And if you want additional information about that, please feel free to contact me. All right, well, I'll go ahead and close that poll, and thank you for this almost 70% of you who participated. Okay. I hope now that you have an idea of how changes are made that you will feel empowered to make suggestions for improvements, because we need to be responsive to what you need and what your users are finding that is not especially working well for them right now. For the rest of this webinar, I will focus on future changes coming to RDA, starting with what will become official with the upcoming April RDA Toolkit update. And I'm sorry to say, I couldn't find good graphics for this part of the presentation. I will cover new elements, significant changes, and other highlights, starting with what is completely new. First is the new element for language of the family, which will be in RDA 10.8. This was added to mirror the established instructions for persons and corporate bodies. And it was added only after FRAD was updated with this element as well. Mirroring the similar instructions in RDA already affected the placement of this new element in Chapter 10. And so it is placed where it would logically be placed in the other chapters, and that forces the renumbering of the subsequent 3 sub-instructions in Chapter 10. The new element subtype, period of activity of the corporate body, will be added at RDA 11.4.5. And this, again, parallels a similar instruction for persons. The period of activity can certainly be used to differentiate among corporate bodies with similar names, the way we use it for people. This change did not require any renumbering because this instruction logically fell at the end of 11.4. And you should note that once you can record it, then obviously if you need to use it to distinguish one corporate body from another in an authorized access point, then it will be available to you for that as well. Next are some significant changes. I alluded to this one a few minutes ago. ALA, with substantial support from the American Association of Law Libraries, put forward a detailed proposal to address problems in RDA that were associated with naming treaties. The JSC agreed to the proposed changes, of course making a few of their own, but the end result is to get treaties to be named by recording the title of the treaty as the preferred title for all treaties, to use the title of the treaty as the basis for the authorized access point, to broaden the definition of RDA's date of a treaty in 6.20.3 to include the date of adoption. And one significant change was moving participant in a treaty, formerly known as signatory to a treaty, from Chapter 6 to Chapter 19, since the JSC decided this signifies a relationship. The other substantive change, and I alluded to this one, well, no, I didn't allude to this one. It's coming later. It's related to music. The RDA Music Joint Working Group put forward a proposal which substantially restructures RDA 6.15, Medium of Performance, and RDA 6.28.1.9, Additions to Access Points representing musical works with titles that are not distinctive. The changes will allow for recording more precise medium of performance information, such as doubling or alternative instruments. Although the instructions will be rearranged, the impact on building authorized access points should be minimal, with one significant exception. The terminology used to record standard combinations of instruments in authorized access points will be replaced with instructions to name each individual instrument in that standard combination. So you would no longer use string quartet in an authorized access point. You would name violins to viola and cello. There are quite a few additional changes, and I just want to hit the highlights here. I will present them in RDA instruction number order because I'm a cataloger. I need to provide some sort of order. First is restructuring and clarifying the core element statement. 2 sentences were added to 0.6.1. Only one instance of a core element is required, and subsequent instances are optional. By clarifying the statement, the JSC affirmed that RDA does not require an all-or-nothing approach to recording additional instances of any core element. For example, for place of publication, your resource might list 4 places. RDA requires recording the first one in all cases. You may choose to record any or all of the additional places of publication. Please note that this statement applies to all core elements and not just those associated with publication, distribution, and so forth. Two instructions relating to part titles will be clarified with the April update. 2.3.1.7, titles of parts, sections, and supplements, has been rewritten to clarify when to include the common title. If it's not on the same source of information as the part title, or if the part title sufficiently identifies the resource, then the common title will not be considered part of the title. However, it may still be recorded as part of a series statement or the title of a related work. A related instruction for the collective title and titles of individual contents in 2.3.2.6 has been restructured to include specific sub-instructions for comprehensive and analytical descriptions. For those resources that have production, publication, distribution, manufacture, and/or copyright dates in more than one calendar, the changes to these instructions clarify that the affected date or dates may be recorded in more than one calendar, but it won't be required to do so. You only need to record the date in the calendar that your cataloging agency prefers. The changes outlined in this slide are structural. They affect the ends of both Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. There will be clearer names for these instructions along with a more straightforward organization. There was a concern that the same name was used for different instructions in two different chapters. You can see that there was a note on manifestation or item in Chapter 2 and the same thing in Chapter 3, but they weren't the same thing. So they've been broken down. A note on manifestation will become a completely separate instruction from note on item in Chapter 2. And the two instructions that are currently 3.21 and 3.22 in Chapter 3 have been restructured, rearranged, and renamed to note on carrier and note on item specific carrier characteristic. One of the more significant changes here is simply the renumbering of note on manifestation or item, which is currently 2.20 to 2.17. Most of the instructions in the current 2.20 have to do with manifestations rather than with items. So when I do a raw count of instructions affected by RDA changes in 2014, that one was big. There were a number of instructions that reference 2.20 in RDA right now. There are additional changes affecting the naming of musical works. The first is a simple clarification of the instructions regarding naming suites, and this should actually not affect what music catalogers are already doing. The second change will have an impact on what is recorded, and that is because cognate forms will now be allowed in certain circumstances. Well, this is a change only if you already aren't following the current LC-PCC PS, which effectively tells you to do the same thing. If you're doing that, there won't actually be a change in practice. It will just change where the instruction resides. This change to the general instruction on liturgical works, again, should not affect what is recorded. Instead, the change is structural. We hope that this more clearly indicates the type of liturgical works that are covered, and by doing this, we also were able to eliminate some final two sub-instructions because they more logically fit earlier into the 6.30.1.5. In relation to recording other designation associated with the person in RDA 9.6, the JSC revised the first sentence in the core element statement. Currently that reads, other designation associated with the person is a core element for a Christian saint or a spirit. That a Christian saint or spirit has been replaced by the bullet that you see here, significantly expanded, a person named in sacred scripture or an apocryphal book, a fictitious or legendary person, a real non-human entity. The second sentence of the core statement remains unchanged. For other persons, other designation associated with the person is a core element when needed to distinguish a person from another person with the same name. This expansion means that you will regularly consider core these other designations for a much broader category of persons than previously. In addition, the general guidelines on constructing authorized access points to represent persons in 9.19.1.1 and title or other designation associated with the person in 9.19.1.2 have been clarified to specify the order of these elements when they are used in constructing access points. And here I will advise you to watch for the upcoming LC-PCC policy statements that will provide guidance about what the NACO and LC practice will be about applying certain options. Another change coming in April is the renaming of 11.7.1.4 from names not conveying the idea of a corporate body to type of corporate body. The related instruction in 11.13.1.2 will also be renamed, and some examples will be added to 11.7.1.5 and 11.7.1.6 to help illustrate the scope of these various instructions. The concept of names not conveying the idea of a corporate body still remains in 11.13, and when you have this situation, you will still add the type of body element to the authorized access point to convey the type of corporate body. In relation to building an access point for a series of conferences, 11.13.1.8.2 will be rephrased to make it clear that the number, date, and/or location of the conferences does not belong in the authorized access point. Finally, the JSC agreed to merge the relationship designators for editor of compilation and editor in Appendix I.3.1. The existence of these two separate but closely related terms had caused some confusion. However, the relationship designator for a compiler as a creator still remains in Appendix I.2.1. Now, a few caveats to what I've just summarized. These changes are not official until they are published in the RDA Toolkit, so please don't jump the gun. And also, if you're looking for more details on the actual wording of these changes, please consult the SEC final documents on the JSC website. Each of the proposals has numbering representing which constituency presented it and then which constituency responded to it. At the end of each of those groupings of documents is the Secretary's final version of the document, and this is what is used to inform the text of changes to RDA for the April update. Beyond April, here's a summary of some possible proposals or discussion papers that the JSC may end up considering in November this year. I'll start with those that ALA is investigating. We're trying to reconcile the differences between the Statement of Responsibility instructions in Chapter 2, which relate to manifestations, and the two instructions in Chapter 7, Performer, Narrator, and/or Presenter, and Artistic and/or Technical Credits, and those relate to expressions. This is a challenging area. ALA submitted a couple of discussion papers regarding machine actionable data elements primarily affecting Chapter 3 in the past few years. Work continues on this effort, which will include the development of an aspect unit quantity model for expressing extent data. Related to this work will be the proposal to create a new element for extent of expression, which will probably reside in Chapter 7. Additional work will be undertaken to create a new element, subject of a work. This is a relationship element that will be proposed for Chapter 23. It will be at a very high level, and ultimately the name may simply be subject. ALA previously submitted a discussion paper on improving instructions for describing relationships, and this affects Chapters 24 through 28. Work will continue, and I hope that we will submit another paper, and perhaps even a proposal, for the JSC in November. Likewise, ALA is continuing its work on expanding Appendix K. This appendix contains relationship designators between instances of persons, families, and corporate bodies. We had submitted a proposal for the JSC in 2013, and this was returned to ALA for more work. Other JSC constituencies have indicated their willingness to work on the following issues: compilations, always a favorite; naming parts of the Bible. This will be coming back from a proposal in 2013 that came from the Deutsche Nationalbibliothek. Some of the challenges of internationalizing the code is how you refer to parts of the Bible in an international context. And choreographic works. The Library of Congress is likely to follow up on their discussion paper about naming choreographic works. And certainly some of the JSC working groups should be providing us either with discussion papers or proposals. I would expect to see something about transferring instructions relating to names of jurisdictions from Chapter 16 to Chapter 11, and more changes related to musical works. So how can you stay informed about all of this? Well, it depends on what you're interested in. If you want to track CCDA activities, there are two major sources: the CCDA blog, the address is here on the screen, and also you can subscribe in a read-only way to their email distribution list. The latter contains discussions of things under consideration and also votes, so some of it might not be as interesting to you if you're not on the committee, but it may be worth tracking to see what's going on. For broader JSC activities, you should bookmark the JSC website and especially regularly visit the news and announcements and working documents pages. In addition, you will see various announcements on RDAL, primarily from the JSC Secretary, about the release of RDA documents that have been recently published to the JSC website. And you can subscribe to that email list as the address on your screen. If you're interested in the specifics about changes to LC-PCC policy statements, the Library of Congress maintains a particular web page that details the various revisions and additions and deletions to the policy statements since RDA was first published. I'll leave this screen up while I feel that I can take your questions now, and I think Felicity was going to help me track those and respond to them. I do have a final page with my email
several
address.
Questions that have come in.
Okay, let's go, Felicity.
Okay, so what's surprising is the amount of time it takes for things to get through the process. So there's a comment here: 18 to 21 months to resolve an issue is somewhat dismaying given the rate at which interfaces change. Do you foresee any changes in the process?
It is really frustrating to all of us that it takes this long. That's why the JSC came up with this alternative, slightly now misnamed fast-track process that doesn't require constituency review. We do want to make sure that when we undertake a significant change to RDA that we've considered all of the implications, and especially the internationalization aspects. So some of the things that hold us up in the process is the need for feedback and the need to mark everything up and get published in the toolkit. And yes, we're definitely looking toward ways to continue to streamline that process. It's frustrating for everyone involved.
Well, you mentioned several constituent groups, so you can see why it takes some time.
Exactly.
Okay, there's been a comment that I've seen on a lot of email lists. The complaint about no longer having the general material designation and how it takes longer to find the type of format in an OPAC record. Do you have any comments on that?
That was a decision that was made during RDA development, and while the GMD is really useful in browse lists, and I know that a lot of us miss it if we aren't including it in our RDA records now, it seems clear that browse lists are not the primary way our users are seeking information. And the other thing was that the GMD is largely replaced by the 33X fields, the content type, carrier type, and media type in MARC. And those elements are actually in RDA as well. And those should be able to be used to the same effect. They're more granular. They are more clearly structured. The problem with the way we use GMDs is we weren't assigning them for everything, and sometimes we didn't assign them for text, for example, in the US. And they sometimes crossed over between content and carrier. So having this stepped back and tried to look at what we were trying to do and also try to find ways to align those elements with the RDA Onyx framework, the Onyx framework and the ISVD Area 0. They're all trying to get at the same thing.
Right. You have here several sources of information. There's a question about where does one find formal announcements on changes? Fast track or proposal changes?
Those are announced in official JSC Secretary documents that reside on the JSC website. Typically, the fast-track changes are summarized about 1 week before those changes roll out to the toolkit, and there is a formal document that lists those changes and is made publicly available. That's what I consulted to get those raw counts for that pie chart, for example. And the official changes that happened as a result of the proposals also come out as SEC final documents before they're published in RDA.
Okay. How about, you talked about the internationalization. So where does one turn to with questions having to do with translation of RDA into other languages? So a hot topic in one country is whether to translate the Appendix I designators.
Yes. There are translations for the translations that have either been published or are close to being published. There are translation teams, and ALA Publishing would, I'm sure, be able to put you in touch with a particular team. Beyond that, it really is the relationship designators. There's definitely an interest in finding ways to use codes or something else that is language neutral that then displays out in different contexts for different users, and especially in different languages. So I understand the complications with the translations, and I give my hats off to those who have been working so hard on that.
A question on changes again. While waiting for an RDA change, can catalogers change things at the local level based on catalogers' judgment?
Well, that would be up to you, I guess. So what we did, for example, with those two things that we got put through as policy statements before RDA, depends on exactly what you're looking to change and how likely you think it is that the JSC might actually agree to an instruction change. So you definitely, if it's something you want to be consistent about, you definitely want to document it locally. If it's something that affects authorities, you might want to hold back and follow established policies. If you're, say, a NACO participant, I don't think NACO really wants you to go rogue. But if it's something that really concerns you, then you should go ahead and contact the people involved with making the policy statements and suggest that there needs to be a policy statement specifically addressing this issue that's causing everyone consternation.
Okay. On resources again, if an institution doesn't have access to the toolkit, is there another place to try and keep up with the rules and best policies?
That would be, I think, difficult. I should note that RDA is available in print and now also as a standalone ebook, so it's a little bit less than the subscription costs of the toolkit, but of course not all of the functionality. The LC-PCC Policy Statements are freely available via LC's website, and I think even via the toolkit website. The Tools tab, I believe, is freely available. So some things in the RDA toolkit are open and others are behind a paywall.
Okay. For the November JSC meeting, which constituencies are working on proposals on compilations?
I would have to look at my notes. I can only tell you that it's not me. It was coming out of a URIG discussion paper, and offhand I cannot remember who is looking at it, and particularly what in particular. There are some very complex issues about what is a work when you have a compilation and who is the creator and what the title is, and it will be, I'm sure it will be investigating some of that, but unfortunately I don't have that off the top of my head to tell you who is working on it. Drop me an email afterward, or I can look it up and have it in the response to this webinar.
Great. So there was a couple questions about MARC and BibFrame, but to start with MARC, does the JSC look at the MARC fields or other things that need to be changes to accommodate RDA?
There used to be an RDA MARC working group, and that was a group that precipitated a lot of the changes, especially to the authorities format, the new 37X and 38X fields. That group is not currently active. The JSC itself, RDA is encoding scheme neutral. So the JSC generally will not be considering MARC implications directly, but if there's a need to form a working group, then one might be formed again.
So would that be true of BibFrame also?
Presumably, yes. Right now the JSC has not been terribly active in the BibFrame front. It is one of the linked data options, and RDA is certainly looking forward to a time where linked data is our primary means of communicating this kind of information. But again, RDA is not interested, at least at this time, in being tied to a single encoding standard or communication standard.
Okay. Let me just point out a comment someone made for everyone. At a locally, institution has added GMDs locally. So that's a possibility for those who missed the GMDs.
Right. You need to be cautious about this. OCLC decided that, I think it's within 3 years, that they will start stripping out GMDs from master records. So if you use one of their products as the source of your discovery, like WorldCat Local or WorldShare Management, I think is what it's called, you may lose those even if you actively put them in now. The GMD is useful in some situations, but it might be better to find ways to use the new 3.3x fields to convey similar kinds of information rather than hanging on to something that a lot of people are now recognizing is sort of on its way out.
Right. Some system design issues.
Right.
Okay. There are several questions, so we'll have to save those and we'll send them to Kathy and can send out the answers with the recording. But one person is interested in seeing the poll of the second poll, the results. I'm wondering if one of our tech people could pop that up.
Well, and I can certainly read that. If 5% had helped draft an RDA change proposal, 4% had participated in a PCC task group. I hope maybe those of you now can see this. 50% had created local RDA documentation, and 23% had posted questions about RDA and etc. on listservs, with 26 haven't thought about it yet.
Great, thank you. Kathy, thank you so much for all this information, but also for the work you're doing on our behalf. I know it takes a lot of time to read all the rules and come up with ideas.
Well, and I can't do it without all of you either, so thanks to all of you who have participated in the process.
Great. So I know from the comments our audience found today's webinar useful too. So you'll soon be receiving a short online evaluation form with links to recording and the slides. And for the Continuing Education Committee, I really want to encourage you to fill out that survey because we'll use that to plan other events. So the CE committee does try to plan a wide range of opportunities to meet different needs. Here's some additional cataloging webinars we have planned this spring. So in April, you can see we have our first Spanish language webinar. And so we are planning some additional ones, and those will be posted on the website as soon as they're ready. But we have additional topics, so I want to encourage you to go to the website and read more about those. In addition to webinars, we have e-forums, which are email discussions that last for 2 days. And you'll find the link here to sign up for those. And continuing education opportunities. These are 4 to 6 week courses. At the bottom there, you'll see we have a cataloging course coming this spring. So that'll give everyone a good grounding in cataloging. So, let me thank Catherine Balick and Vicki Grzinski. They're our technical support, and they helped to make today's webinar work. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. We look forward to your questions and comments and having you participate in other activities.